For more of this kind of content, you can subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment. The Palace of Zenthara had stood for millennia, a gleaming fortress of crystal and light that floated in the heart of a radiant nebula. Its grandeur symbolized the might and wisdom of the Zenthari race, and within its hallowed halls resided their queen, Carol, a figure of unyielding strength and intelligence, her very presence a beacon to her people. But tonight, the calm of the royal chambers was shattered. Carol's gaze bore into Edward, the human envoy sent from Earth. A truce had been the goal of his visit, a delicate negotiation between their species, but the conversation had taken an unexpected turn. A touch, that's all it took. His hand, warm and unyielding, had grazed hers, setting her senses ablaze. "You shouldn't have touched me," she repeated, her voice trembling, an uncharacteristic vulnerability sneaking into her tone. She was not a woman prone to doubt, yet Edward had awakened something deep, primal, and impossible to ignore. Edward remained steadfast, his emerald eyes sharp. "I said it was an accident. I didn't know it would do this." Carol paced to the edge of the room, her movements sharp but elegant. The soft glow of the nebula outside, casting iridescent shadows across her luminous blue skin. The air between them crackled with tension, an invisible thread binding them closer with each second. "It's more than a touch," she said, her voice tight. "It's a bond, a Zenthari bond. It's irreversible, Edward. You've tied yourself to me in ways you can't possibly understand." His expression didn't falter. "Then explain it to me," he said, taking a step closer. His presence was magnetic, and Carol hated how her breath hitched at his approach. "You don't seem like the type to be afraid of something just because it's unfamiliar." Her sharp blue eyes flashed, and a wry smile tugged at her lips despite herself. "Arrogant human," she said, folding her arms. "You have no idea what you've stepped into." Edward shrugged, his confidence unwavering. "Then teach me. Help me understand this bond, because I'm not walking away." She wanted to laugh at his audacity, to dismiss him outright, but the truth was, she couldn't. The bond coursing through her veins had already made sure of that. Her every nerve hummed with his presence, her thoughts clouded by the memory of his touch. Denying it would be a lie. But before she could respond, the room quaked violently, a low rumble echoing through the palace. The shimmering crystal walls trembled, their usual tranquility shattered. Carol's expression darkened, her instincts taking over. What was that? Edward was already moving, his military instincts sharp. Trouble! Another tremor rocked the palace, and this time, the distinct sound of battle echoed through the corridors. Screams, the hum of energy weapons, the clatter of footsteps, it all came rushing toward them. Carol straightened, her commanding presence returning in full force. "An attack," she said, striding to the door. Her fingers danced across a glowing console, summoning a holographic display. Figures cloaked in shadow were breaching the outer defenses, their movements swift and deliberate. Edward grabbed a fallen Zenthari weapon, its sleek design fitting naturally in his hand. "Do you have a plan, or are we improvising?" Carol shot him a glare that was half annoyance, half admiration. "Follow me. Don't get in my way." They burst into the corridor, the air thick with the acrid scent of plasma discharges. Zenthari guards fought valiantly against the intruders, but the enemy was relentless. Their faces were obscured, their forms blending into the shadows, as if they were one with the darkness itself. "Who are they?" Edward asked, keeping pace with Carol as they navigated the chaos. "Mercenaries," she replied, her tone clipped. "Hired by someone who seeks to destabilize the Zenthari throne. They've grown bolder since the alliance talks with Earth began." Edward smirked. "So I'm not just a diplomat, I'm a target." "Don't flatter yourself," she shot back, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of worry. "They're after me." As they reached the central atrium, a massive explosion ripped through the chamber ahead, sending shards of crystal raining down. Carol raised a glowing shield of energy, deflecting the debris with practiced precision. Edward stared in awe. "Impressive." She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Try to keep up." They moved as one, their steps perfectly synchronized as if the bond had extended to their movements. Carol's energy pulses cut through the enemy ranks, while Edward's tactical precision brought down their attackers with ruthless efficiency. They were an unlikely duo, but together they were unstoppable. But as the battle raged, Carol felt the weight of the bond growing stronger, more insistent. Every glance from Edward, every brush of his presence, sent a jolt of electricity through her. It was maddening, intoxicating, and deeply dangerous. When the final enemy fell, the room was silent but for the sound of their labored breathing. Edward turned to her, his face streaked with soot, but his eyes blazing with determination. "Is this what you deal with every day?" "More or less," she replied, though her voice wavered slightly. She was not accustomed to vulnerability, and yet here he was, a human, her bonded partner, standing at her side. Before she could say more, a faint beeping emanated from a fallen intruder's wrist. Carol's eyes widened as she realized what it was. "Edward, run!" she shouted, grabbing his arm, just as the device detonated in a blinding flash of light. The explosion tore through the atrium like a thunderclap, its force hurling Carol and Edward into the adjacent corridor. The shimmering crystal walls groaned under the pressure, cracks spidering through their surfaces. For a moment, everything was chaos, blinding light, deafening noise, and the acrid stench of burnt metal. Carol was the first to regain her footing. Her ears rang and her vision swam, but her Zenthari resilience kicked in quickly. She turned to Edward, who lay sprawled nearby, groaning as he pushed himself upright. "Are you hurt?" she demanded, kneeling beside him. Her fingers hovered over his arm, instinctively checking for injuries. Edward coughed, waving her off with a pained grin. "Just my pride. That was one hell of a welcome party." Despite the situation, Carol felt a flicker of amusement at his indomitable spirit. "You're reckless," she said, though her tone lacked its usual bite. "But alive, I suppose that's something." She offered him a hand, and he took it without hesitation. As their skin touched, the bond flared again, a rush of warmth and energy that left her breathless. Edward's green eyes met hers, and for a fleeting moment, the chaos around them faded into the background. "You felt that too," he said, his voice low. Carol pulled her hand back as if burned. "Focus," she snapped, more to herself than to him. "We're not out of danger yet." The palace trembled again, the structural integrity weakening under the relentless assault. Alarms blared in the distance, signaling breaches in multiple sectors. Carol activated her wrist communicator, a holographic map of the palace springing to life above her hand. "The intruders are converging on the central vault," she said, her eyes narrowing. "They're after the Starstone." Edward frowned. "What's the Starstone?" "A relic of immense power," Carol explained as they moved quickly through the corridors, her voice sharp with urgency. "It's what keeps Zenthara afloat, literally. If they take it, the palace will collapse, and the planet below will suffer catastrophic fallout. So, no pressure," Edward muttered, gripping the weapon he'd salvaged. As they approached the vault, the air grew heavy with the hum of energy fields. The massive doors, engraved with ancient Zenthari runes, stood slightly ajar, a clear sign that the intruders were already inside. Carol motioned for Edward to follow her lead. "Stay behind me," she whispered. "The vault is heavily shielded, but the attackers must have a disruptor device. They'll be vulnerable while they're working on it." Edward nodded, his expression serious. "Got it." They slipped through the gap in the doors, the room beyond bathed in the ethereal glow of the Starstone. The artifact hovered in the center of the chamber, a pulsating orb of light that seemed to breathe with an otherworldly rhythm. Surrounding it were a dozen intruders, their cloaked forms illuminated in stark contrast. Carol didn't hesitate. She raised her hands, and twin arcs of energy shot from her palms, striking two of the attackers before they could react. Edward followed suit, his precision taking out another with a well-placed shot. The room erupted into chaos as the remaining mercenaries scrambled to defend themselves. The fight was brutal and fast-paced. Carol moved like a force of nature, her energy blasts carving through the enemy ranks. Edward was equally relentless, his combat training evident in every calculated strike. Together, they were an unstoppable tide, the bond between them amplifying their synchronicity. But the mercenaries were resourceful. As the last of their number fell, a hidden figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, imposing alien with a disruptor device clutched in its clawed hands. It activated the device, and the room was plunged into darkness, the Starstone's glow flickering weakly. Carol's breath caught. No! The disruptor pulsed, sending waves of destabilizing energy through the chamber. The floor beneath them began to crack, and the walls groaned ominously. Edward didn't hesitate. He charged at the alien, dodging its wild swings and tackling it to the ground. The disruptor clattered from its grasp, skidding across the floor toward Carol. "Destroy it!" Edward shouted, grappling with the creature. Carol lunged for the disruptor, her fingers closing around its sleek surface. She could feel the raw power emanating from it, a chaotic force designed to unmake everything it touched. With a surge of determination, she channeled her own energy into the device, overloading its circuits. The disruptor exploded in a blinding flash, and the Starstone's light flared back to life, steady and strong. The chamber stabilized, the cracks in the floor sealing themselves as the palace's energy systems recovered. Carol turned to see Edward still locked in combat with the alien. She moved swiftly, striking the attacker with a concentrated pulse of energy that sent it sprawling. Edward stood, breathing heavily, and gave her a nod of thanks. "Nice timing," he said, his grin returning despite the chaos. "Reckless," she muttered, but there was a hint of warmth in her tone. "But effective." As the last of the intruders were dealt with, the room fell silent once more. Carol approached the Starstone, her fingers brushing its surface. The bond within her flared again, a reminder of the connection she now shared with Edward. "That was close," Edward said, stepping beside her. "Too close." Carol nodded, her gaze fixed on the Starstone. "This bond, it's stronger than I expected," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "And it's only going to grow." Edward placed a hand on her shoulder, the gesture firm yet gentle. "Then we face it together," he said simply. For the first time, Carol allowed herself to believe it might be possible. Together, they could face whatever challenges lay ahead, whether from outside forces or the uncharted depths of their own connection. But even as they stood there, the Starstone's light casting their shadows on the walls, Carol couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Somewhere in the vast reaches of the cosmos, a far greater threat loomed, one that would test the limits of their bond and their courage. The Starstone's ethereal light bathed the chamber in a soft glow as the chaos of the attack faded into silence. Carol stood beside Edward, her hands still tingling with residual energy from the battle. Her breathing was steady, but her heart raced, though she told herself it wasn't from the fight. Edward turned to her, his green eyes bright with an intensity she couldn't ignore. His face was streaked with soot, his black hair tousled, and yet he exuded a rugged confidence that made her pulse quicken. The bond between them thrummed in the air, palpable and inescapable. "You keep staring," Edward said, his lips curling into a faint, teasing smile. "Starting to think you like having me around, Your Majesty." Carol's lips tightened, though her cheeks warmed at his boldness. "You're presumptuous, Edward," she said, folding her arms. "I'm still deciding whether you're more trouble than you're worth." "Come on," he said, stepping closer. "I saved your palace, helped protect your priceless artifact, and fought at your side. Surely I've earned a few points?" She arched a brow. "You're insufferable, and you're avoiding the question," he countered, his voice lowering slightly. "Admit it, there's something here, between us." Carol's breath caught, and for a moment, she was at a loss for words. She prided herself on her ability to command any situation, but Edward's unwavering gaze and the raw honesty in his voice unraveled her defenses. "You have no idea what you've awakened," she said quietly, her tone a mixture of frustration and vulnerability. "This bond, it's not just some fleeting attraction. It's deeper, stronger, and it terrifies me." Edward's expression softened. "Then let me help you face it. Whatever this is, we're in it together." Her instinct was to dismiss him, to push him away and reassert control. But as his hand brushed against hers deliberately this time, she felt the surge of warmth and energy that had haunted her since their first touch. It wasn't just the bond, it was him. His presence, his strength, his unshakable determination. "You're dangerous," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Only to the people who threaten you," he replied, stepping closer still. They were inches apart now, the air between them charged with unspoken tension. "To you, I'll be whatever you need me to be." Carol's heart hammered in her chest. She knew the bond was inescapable, but this connection, this pull was something else entirely. It was raw, powerful, and undeniably real. For years, she had been the unflinching queen, her every decision calculated and precise. Yet now, with Edward, she felt like a woman unmoored, caught in the tide of something far beyond her control. "You're reckless," she said, her voice trembling. "And you're worth it," he replied without hesitation. Before she could stop herself, she reached up, her fingers brushing against his cheek. The contact sent a jolt through both of them, and for a moment, the world seemed to fade away. She could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong, echoing through the bond. "This is madness," she murmured. "Maybe," Edward said, his hand covering hers. "But sometimes, madness is exactly what we need." The intensity of his gaze, the warmth of his touch, it was overwhelming. Carol felt as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice, torn between the safety of what she knew and the thrill of the unknown. We can't, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Our worlds, they're too different. This bond, it complicates everything. Or it simplifies everything, Edward countered, his voice steady. The bond exists for a reason. Maybe it's not about biology or politics. Maybe it's just about us. Carol's resolve faltered, and for the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility. Could she let go of her fears, her doubts, and embrace the connection they shared? Could she trust him not just as an ally, but as something more? Before she could answer, the sound of distant footsteps echoed through the corridor outside the vault. Carol stiffened, the spell between them broken. Guards, she said, stepping back. Her voice regained its authoritative edge, though her eyes lingered on Edward's for a moment longer. They'll be looking for me. Edward nodded, his expression a mix of understanding and determination. We're not done talking about this, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Carol allowed herself a small wry smile. You're persistent, I'll give you that. It's part of my charm, he said with a grin. As the guards entered the chamber, their expressions a mix of relief and concern, Carol straightened, slipping back into her role as queen. But even as she issued orders and reassured her people, her thoughts remained on Edward. The bond between them wasn't just a connection, it was a spark, a flame that refused to be extinguished. And no matter how much she tried to deny it, she knew that her life and her heart would never be the same. The royal chambers were eerily quiet after the chaos of the attack. Carol sat by the wide crystal window, the glow of the distant nebula casting soft light across her features. She had dismissed the guards and advisors who had been clamoring for her attention, needing a moment to think to process. But she wasn't alone for long. The quiet hiss of the chamber doors opening broke her reverie, and she turned to see Edward stepping inside. He was still in the same tattered uniform, streaked with soot and battle grime, but his confident stride and piercing green eyes were unshaken. His presence filled the room, as if he belonged there. You've made yourself at home, Carol said, her tone cool, but laced with a hint of dry amusement. Edward shrugged, leaning casually against a crystalline column. Figured I'd check in on you. After all, I did save your palace. Twice. Twice? She arched a brow. You're counting now? Can't help it, he said with a smirk. I like keeping track of how often I've impressed you. Carol shook her head, though she couldn't suppress the faint smile tugging at her lips. You're insufferable. And you're avoiding the obvious? Edward countered, his expression softening as he stepped closer. That bond between us, it's not going away. So, why are you still pretending it doesn't matter? Her smile faded, replaced by the guarded look she had perfected over years of rule. Because it complicates everything. I am a queen, Edward. I have responsibilities, alliances, and enemies who would use this against me. I cannot afford to indulge in distractions. Distractions, Edward echoed, his voice laced with disbelief. He took another step forward, his emerald eyes locking with hers. That's all this is to you? Carol hesitated, her resolve faltering under his steady gaze. The truth was, it wasn't just a distraction. It was all-consuming. Every time he was near, the bond hummed with a restless energy, pulling her toward him. She couldn't think clearly when he looked at her like that, as if he could see right through her defenses. It's more than that, she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. But it doesn't change the fact that this bond, whatever it is, puts us both at risk. Edward's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. I've faced risks my entire life, Carol. I've fought wars, negotiated peace, and stared down death more times than I can count. This, what's between us, isn't something I'm afraid of. And I don't think you are, either. She looked away, her hands clenching in her lap. You don't understand. The bond isn't just an emotional connection. It's deeper. It ties us together in ways that can't be undone. My thoughts, my feelings, they're not entirely my own anymore. You could influence me without even trying, and that makes me vulnerable. Edward knelt before her, his voice gentle but firm. Then I'll make you a promise. I'll never use this bond against you. I'll never take advantage of it, but I won't pretend it doesn't exist, and I won't walk away from it. From you. His words hung in the air, and for a moment Carol felt as though the weight of her crown had been lifted. There was something in his gaze, a sincerity, a steadfastness that made her want to believe him. Against all logic, she felt herself leaning closer, drawn to him by a force she couldn't explain. You're a stubborn man, she said, her voice soft. And you're a stubborn queen, he replied, a faint smile playing on his lips. For a moment, the room seemed to shrink around them, the only sound, the steady rhythm of their breaths. Carol reached out, her fingers brushing against his cheek. The bond flared between them, a surge of warmth and connection that sent shivers down her spine. "Edward," she said, her voice trembling, "if we let this happen, there's no turning back." He covered her hand with his touch steady and reassuring. "Then let it happen. I'm not afraid of what comes next." The air between them was electric, charged with unspoken words and unfulfilled promises. Carol leaned in, her gaze locked on his, her heartbeat racing as she closed the distance between them. But before their lips could meet, a sharp chime echoed through the room, shattering the moment. Carol pulled back, her expression hardening as she rose to her feet. "Someone's at the door," she said, her voice regaining its regal composure. Edward sighed, standing as well. "Of course they are. Perfect timing." Carol moved to the console by the door, her fingers dancing across the glowing interface. The image of a Zenthari guard appeared, his expression grim. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing deeply. "There's been another breach. We've captured an intruder who claims to have vital information about the attack." "Bring them to the throne room," Carol commanded, her tone sharp. "I'll handle this personally." The guard nodded and disappeared from the display. Carol turned to Edward, her expression unreadable. "It seems our conversation will have to wait." Edward nodded, though his eyes lingered on hers. "This isn't over, Carol. Not by a long shot." She didn't respond, but as she strode from the room, she felt the bond between them pulsing with a quiet intensity. The battle might be over, but the war within her heart was far from won. The grand throne room of Zenthara was a masterpiece of alien elegance, its crystalline pillars reaching skyward, reflecting light in a kaleidoscope of colors. The Starstone's restored energy thrummed faintly in the background, a reminder of how narrowly the palace had escaped destruction. Carol sat on the elevated throne, her posture regal but tense. The weight of her crown felt heavier tonight, not because of the intruders, but because of the man standing at her side. Edward, tall and commanding, exuded an unshakable confidence that drew curious glances from the Zenthari guards stationed along the room's perimeter. Before them, the prisoner knelt, an alien cloaked in tattered robes, his blue skin streaked with grime. His eyes, dark and sunken, darted nervously between Carol and Edward. "You have one chance to speak," Carol said, her voice cold and imperious. "Who sent you, and what do they want?" The prisoner hesitated, his gaze flickering to Edward. "A human," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "What is a human doing in the Queen's court?" Edward crossed his arms, leaning slightly toward the prisoner. "I could ask you the same question. Why don't you save us the time and answer hers?" Carol's lips curved into a faint smile, but she quickly masked it. The bond between them hummed again, a subtle reminder of Edward's unwavering support. She focused her attention back on the prisoner, her tone hardening. "Speak, or you'll wish you had." The prisoner flinched, the threat clearly landing. "I work for the Syndicate," he blurted, his voice trembling. "They sent us to destabilize Zenthara, to take the Starstone and weaken your rule." Carol's eyes narrowed. "The Syndicate. They've been a thorn in my side for years. Why now? What has emboldened them?" The prisoner hesitated, his gaze darting between her and Edward again. They know about the bond." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Carol stiffened, her mind racing. Beside her, Edward straightened, his expression darkening. "What do you mean they know about the bond?" Carol demanded. The prisoner swallowed hard. "The bond between you and the human. They knew it would form. They said it would make you vulnerable, distracted. They planned to exploit it." Carol's chest tightened. The bond wasn't just a personal struggle, it was now a political weapon. Her enemies had anticipated it, used it against her, and nearly succeeded. Edward stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "How do they know about something so specific? This isn't just some coincidence." The prisoner's gaze darted to the floor. "I don't know, I swear. The Syndicate has eyes everywhere. They see things others can't. That's all I know." Carol rose from her throne, her presence commanding. "Take him to the holding cells. I'll decide his fate later." The guards moved swiftly, hauling the prisoner to his feet and dragging him from the room. As the doors closed behind them, the throne room fell into silence. Edward turned to Carol, his expression serious. "This isn't just about the Syndicate, is it?" She shook her head, pacing the length of the room. "Number. The bond is rare, but it's not unheard of. For them to predict it, to know it would happen between us specifically, there's more at play here. Someone with intimate knowledge of Zenthari biology is feeding them information, and they're using it to undermine you," Edward said, his tone grim. to make you question your decisions, your judgment. Carol stopped, turning to face him. And it's working, she admitted, her voice quieter than before. Every moment I spend thinking about this bond, about us, I wonder if I'm compromising my people's safety, if I'm putting my personal feelings above my duty. Edward stepped closer, his green eyes searching hers. Carol, listen to me. You're a queen, yes, but you're also more than that. You're a person, a strong, brilliant, and compassionate person. You don't have to fight this alone. She looked up at him, her defenses crumbling under the weight of his words. I don't know how to balance this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You've become a part of me, Edward, but I can't let that cloud my judgment. Edward reached out, his hand brushing against hers. The bond flared again, a pulse of warmth and connection that left no room for doubt. Then let me be your strength when you need it. Let me be the one thing you don't have to carry on your own. Carol's breath hitched, her heart racing. For years, she had been the unshakable queen, bearing the burdens of her people alone. But now, standing before Edward, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years' hope. You're relentless, she said, her lips curving into a faint smile. And you're worth it, Edward replied, his voice steady and sure. For a moment, the tension between them softened, replaced by a quiet understanding. But Carol knew the challenges ahead were far from over. The bond was both a strength and a vulnerability, and their enemies would stop at nothing to exploit it. As she returned to the throne, Edward stepped to her side, his presence a steadying force. Together, they faced the glowing Starstone, its light a reminder of the fragile balance they had to maintain. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, Carol felt as though she wasn't facing it alone. The throne room of Zenthara was alive with energy, the Starstone's glow pulsating as if responding to the tension in the air. Carol stood at the center of the room, her crimson hair cascading over her shoulders, her sapphire blue skin glowing faintly in the light. Beside her stood Edward, his black hair disheveled, his emerald eyes sharp and unwavering. Before them loomed the leader of the syndicate, a towering figure cloaked in shadows, his voice a rasping echo. You've let your emotions cloud your judgment, Queen Carol, he sneered. This bond with the human weakens you. It makes you vulnerable. Carol's lips tightened, her regal demeanor unbroken. You're wrong. This bond has made me stronger than you could ever imagine. The syndicate leader let out a low, menacing laugh. You've tied yourself to a fleeting creature, a being who will wither and fade while you endure. The bond will destroy you, and I will watch as your precious kingdom crumbles. Edward stepped forward, his stance firm, his weapon ready. Funny how you're the one talking about strength while hiding behind an army of mercenaries and shadows. The leader snarled, his form flickering, as he activated an energy weapon. Then let's see if your connection is enough to save you both. In an instant, the room erupted into chaos. Mercenaries flooded in, their weapons blazing. Carol and Edward moved as one, their bond guiding them with a precision that felt almost supernatural. Her energy blasts lit up the room, weaving seamlessly with Edward's precise, tactical strikes. You've gotten better at this, Carol said, her voice cutting through the din as she deflected a barrage of fire with a glowing shield. Good teacher, Edward quipped, taking down a mercenary with a swift shot. Their synchronization was undeniable, the bond between them pulsing with every shared glance, every moment of unspoken understanding. It was more than instinct, it was trust, forged in battle and strengthened by something deeper. But the syndicate leader was no ordinary foe. With a wave of his hand, he unleashed a wave of dark energy that knocked them both back, the force slamming Carol against a pillar. She groaned, her vision blurring as she struggled to rise. Carol, Edward shouted, rushing to her side. He knelt, his hands gripping her shoulders, his gaze searching hers. Are you okay? I'm fine, she said, though her voice wavered. She met his eyes, the bond between them flaring with intensity. We have to end this. Together. Edward nodded, helping her to her feet. What's the plan? She glanced at the Starstone, its light dimming under the syndicate's assault. We have to channel its energy. It's the only way to stop him. Edward frowned. Won't that... Yes, she interrupted. It'll amplify the bond, permanently. Are you ready for that? He held her gaze, his expression unwavering. I was ready the moment I touched you. Her heart swelled, the vulnerability in his words cutting through her fear. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his. The bond surged, their connection strengthening as the Starstone's energy began to flow through them. Hold on to me, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. Together they raised their hands, their combined energy intertwining with the Starstone's light. A blinding beam of power erupted from the orb, engulfing the syndicate leader and his forces. The room trembled as the dark energy dissipated, the mercenaries collapsing in defeat. When the light faded, the throne room was silent. The syndicate leader was gone, his form reduced to shadows that melted into the floor. The Starstone pulsed gently, its glow steady once more. Carol turned to Edward, her breath hitching as their eyes met. The bond between them was stronger now, an unbreakable thread that bound their fates together. She could feel his emotions, his thoughts, his unwavering devotion. "You did it," he said, his voice soft. "We did it." She smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that felt foreign, yet freeing. "You're impossible," she said, shaking her head, "and I wouldn't have it any other way." He grinned, stepping closer. "That's the most roundabout way of saying you like me I've ever heard." Carol laughed, the sound light and uncharacteristically human. "Maybe I do," she admitted, "but don't let it go to your head." "Too late," he said, his tone teasing but warm. As they stood together in the glow of the Starstone, Carol felt a rare sense of peace. The bond, once a source of fear and doubt, had become her greatest strength. And though the path ahead was uncertain, she knew she wouldn't face it alone. Their destinies were intertwined, their connection unshakable. For better or worse, the Queen and the human were bound by something deeper than words, a flame that would burn brightly for as long as they both lived. And in the heart of Zenthara, under the light of the nebula, a new chapter began.